Today we're going to be talking about the wonderful parish of Strath. It's on the island of Skye, and this is the first time we've been to the island of Skye in our meetings, and it probably will be the last one we do. So we're going to really enjoy Skye today. A bit of Skye fun we're going to be having. Quite a lot of people in one way or another are connected to this. It turned out that quite a few people are connected by, marriage and other ways through their extended family trees. So it's going to be fun. The research has been done by Kay Lally, who is from Taranaki in New Zealand. And Kay visited Skye a number of times with the thought that her ancestors lived there. Her aunt had put this idea in her head that her great-grandfather was a shepherd on Skye. And anyway, it turned out that he came from Gairloch, but maybe he was on Skye at some stage. And so Kay's been there a number of times and feels quite at home when she goes there. So that's a nice thing. She hopes that you'll be able to get some inspiration to travel to Skye when it's possible to do that. So here we go with our session. We'll look at the usual sort of sources, but this will be a bit of a different parish because of its different location and different geography. So we're going to be looking at where it is and what the geography is like there. That's quite an interesting thing for this parish. We're going to look at the number of people who live there, the opportunities for earning some income, what their number of poor are there, what their health and housing diet, some McLennans who live there, some famous McLennans we're going to see there, very famous, particularly in North America, and the Heritors and the Minister, and something about a few curiosities that you'll find out. That's quite a good part. Okay, over to you, Kay.
Thank you, Bruce. Tēnā koutou katoa. Today, welcome. We're going away from the highlands across to the islands and the beautiful, mystical Isle of Skye. So Strath, if you've ever driven to Skye, across Skye Bridge, then you've driven into and through Strath. It's the valley as you come across and move along the top of the bottom peninsula, if you like. The name was originally Strathswardle, Strath being the Gaelic for valley, and Swardle is a Danish word which means sort of green, grassy area, so a green valley. It's described by Thomas Fraser of the Inverness Academy, who wrote this account, more about him later. It's described as of irregular shape on the sound which separates Skye from the mainland. He gives its dimensions as 13 by 3.5, well, 3.5 Scotch miles. The Scotch mile was the measurement, then it's slightly longer than the imperial mile. And in the middle it's flat, but it's mostly hilly, with some large hills at its western end, and it has safe harbours. It is neighboured by, so you can see how close it is to the mainland on its northwestern and western end, and to the east, sorry, WE, I should know, yeah, on its eastern end. It's the west of the Highlands, yes. Next one, I think Bruce shows us that Skye had 7 parishes. So Strath had neighbouring parishes of Brackadale, Portree and Slate on the island. And then across on the mainland, we have Applecross, Lochhelsh, Glenelg. So it's close to numerous other parishes, but Strath is in this portion of the Isle of Skye. As its name suggests, it follows that long thin valley. It also had 3 islands, they're numbered 1, 2, 3 there. Parbe is the biggest, and Longa as the littlest, and the middle one, I've forgotten its name, lost it.
Longay.
Longay is the littlest one. Never mind. There are 3 little islands. It says it right at the beginning. Scalpa is the big one, Parbe and Longay, that's right. Okay. So, and the Coolin Hills are a feature that begin in Strath and then go up into Brackadale, as you can see there. Right. Next one, Bruce, shows us we have, this has its borders. We have harbours, safe harbouring for any size vessel, the account says, in the locks in the southwest this time. This big sea locks there, and this sound of Scalpa at the top. So this is sheltered waters.
Broadford is a really important place, isn't it?
Broadford is the only significant population concentration then and now, really, in Strath. There's scattered, even today there is scattered housing. Today you come across Skye Bridge, you can see that orange road, that's the way in. In the 1790s, there was nothing developed along there. Instead, you came from Glenshiel to Glenelg and across Carlray there to and at the narrowest point is where they had a ferry, which makes sense, and also was used. And then you can see the grey path across to the flatter part of Strath, so that's through a valley and comes down to Broadford on the northern side.
You remember, people, when Kathy, who's here today, did the Loch Alsh Parish talk, we discovered that this was hardly a significant route at all by land along here. Maybe because of this loch long in there, might have been what prevented any sort of traffic going along there. But this was also where, after the first Jacobite risings, a military barracks was put in here at Glenelg, just here. And so that became, and the government road was built to that barracks, you know, as part of the controlling of the Highlands. So this became an important route for that reason. They put bridges and so on in long before this became a viable road up here. And of course, therefore, they came across this narrow point. And cattle, people growing cattle in here would swim their cattle across this narrow point. They'd have to wait for the right tides, I think, to save them being washed out to sea. But that's the sort of story of coming. Glenelg was much more important. This became very important once the railway, that's the black line there, arrived here. Then that was the obvious transport route to bring it on the railway, then come across and carry on.
In the 1790s, you came by sea that way. This is the air here is moist and foggy, and there's frequent rain, and it rains more heavily here than on the rest of Skye, says Mr. Fraser. You can see, well, we'll talk about the arable lands later. I think the next one shows us one of the large conical hills. He says these are the hills on the north side of the parish. This is behind Broadford. This is Bedna Callip. You can see it's tall, it's snow-capped in winter, and it's rocky and barren. So there's the large hills are very rocky. There's a lot of rock in Skye.
Spectacular, aren't they? I mean, that's an amazing photo with that village under the mountain. It's when you go there, it's really quite spectacular, and they look good too from Applecross and those parts. Yes. Looking out the mainland towards Skye, you see the Coolins there.
Yeah, so this is part of the red Coolins, this one. Here is one of the sheltered sea locks, Loch Icenort it's called now, and it's looking back towards the Coolins, so you can see the beautiful vistas that Skye has to offer, and there would have been safe harbouring there, but then nothing he talks about nothing being brought ashore or anything, so I don't know, it's just sheltered, I suppose. The other photograph is to remind you that those of you living in the north of North America will know these things, but midnight on the longest day in Strath, here it is, the sky is not dark at midnight on the longest day because it's 57.2 degrees north, and conversely in the summer, in the winter, the sun sets at 3:41 p.m. So in the summer, you have these very long days of daylight, which gives daylight hours for plants to grow. But in the winter, of course, the opposite, very long nights and short days. And so it's important that the people have they haven't a lot of time to work in the winter, and they have to be inside and keeping warm. So those are the challenges of living at this latitude.
You can see there that they spell Skye without an E in
Yes.
some of these old records. Don't be too, that's not a typo. It's a quote.
Yeah. It's very moist and foggy and soggy from that, I think, is probably the thing.
Let's talk about the soils in this parish. You know, of course, you'd expect that talking about soils, these mountains that we've seen are very rocky and don't provide any feed or opportunity for growing things of any sort. But the account talks about the variability of the soil, how some of it's quite clay, some of it is black loam, some of it is mossy, meaning, you know, suitable for collecting peat. And some of it is covered in heath. What did Liz say about the ones that have got heath? One is on limestone and one is on granite, something like that. The heath grows on different types of rocks or rocky soil. And then down at the bottom of some of these mountains, you have what the statistical account calls volcanic rubbish, meaning like these sort of broken up stones that you see around the lower parts of the mountain. Gone too far. Yeah. So, and also you have quite an unusual thing here that a geologist could explain better than me. And that's quite a lot of limestone, both stone just in loose form, but also in the sort of form where it's intermingled with soil and therefore provides a fertilizer, you know, what's called marl. That's this term marl that we've seen before. It means intermingled limestone. And of course, that's good for crops, the acidity levels. And marble is a cousin of limestone, and this is a marble staircase in a house, Armadale House, near in the neighbouring parish, that made from marble from this parish. You can see it's quite elaborate, isn't it? And
that was built in 1801. So
yeah, so you know it's very much in the period we're talking about.
Yeah.
And limestone from here was used in all sorts of places, like Versailles Palace, the Vatican.
The marble, yeah.
Marble, what did I say? Yeah, the marble was used in all these other parts of the world. Sent off. There was somewhere else too, wasn't there?
Iona.
Iona.
Yeah.
Go. And there's some iron ore deposits, like the sort of thing we saw in Gairloch when we were there. This is
just the Fraser, in writing the account, he dismissed the marble, saying it was too poor to admit of a fine polish, so he didn't think much of it. Clearly he was wrong.
But you know, we have other evidence that there obviously was some good marble, which is a good thing. This is a aerial topographic map, you know, showing you that there's a few mountains over on this side. This is that point where they come across with the cattle and the ferry and so on. And then you come up this way to get to the road, and then you've got the bigger mountains over on this side here of the and the valley in the middle. And then further on, you've got the Aird, what's called Strath Aird down here, which is like a separate part really. But just little pockets. You can see from this picture that there are not, there are a lot of rocky bits and limited amount of space for agriculture. But a long coastline, all the way from here, all that coastline around there, and it cuts across here. From the border with the Sleat is down through here. And then you got more coastline and harbours in here. So it's quite a good parish in many ways. This is some of the rocks, that we looked at before. A little bit of crop growing there, modern photo, obviously. This is the sort of coastline, what it looks like. Yeah. Now, population.
Right. How many people live there? Well, in June 1794, the account says there's a total of 1,579 souls, an increase from 10 years before when there'd been 1,200 plus. But he makes the point that under nines weren't counted then, suggesting perhaps they were in 1579. However, there certainly is an increase, and he puts it down in the last 20 years to smallpox vaccines and a change in the number of people using the land. There were 4 to 5 gentlemen landowners, and now there are many smaller tenants. But some of these tenants have large families, 10 have families of 5 persons. So there's a population increase, and this contents page from this particular volume of the old statistical account shows increases from 1755 to 95, and for Strath it's 636. And for the 30 parishes there, some of which are also on Skye, but they're all over the place, a total increase in that period of 8,620. So we're looking at population growth.
Explosion, really, isn't it?
It is really.
You'll remember that the old statistical account was published as the reports came in, not in county or whatever order. Mm. So these are just sort of random parishes, yes, for that reason, that they just put it out when they came in and then moved on to the next ones and chased up the stragglers. So the chances go on.
Sorry, I was going to say, you may not be able to read the detail, but the second to last right-hand column is the ones with decreases, and there's only 1, 2, 3, 4. There's only a very handful that had a decrease in population. So definitely. And
that's near Glasgow. That one, I'm not sure where that is.
No.
We miss. They're only small.
Yes, small sites.
So the big ones are this one. It may be something to do with the change in the boundaries or whatever.
Could be, but certainly the total of the population is increasing, and in Strath has put it down to these reasons.
Yeah, and yeah, so that's a very interesting thing to see. Again, the population is growing, and we've seen just a minute ago how limited the soil and opportunity for more people to live on it is. In other words, the population's outgrowing the ability of the parish to support itself. Next.
So what did they manage to grow there? Oats are the only grain produced, sown in April, harvested September to October, so while you've still got daylight. Potatoes, however, had become the principal article of food for the lower classes. So McLennans probably ate potatoes. They raised black cattle. That was the primary animal produce. But a great quantity of meal, he says, has to be imported annually, so that they were not able to produce enough meal to either feed the cattle or the people, whatever it was used for. Kelp was another possible cash crop because there's lots of coastline, but they didn't make a lot, 100 tonnes a year made annually. But the price was falling. It had fallen from £6 a tonne to almost half that. So it wasn't particularly lucrative, and no mention's made of it being used locally as manure. So perhaps whatever they made, they sold, but it wasn't, or certainly not regarded as a major source of income. There's some kelp, there's obviously a lot of it about. So oats, potatoes, and black cattle were their main thing.
And a need to import a lot of meal meaning, ground grains.
Yes.
Probably for humans.
They were blessed with wildlife. The sea around them gave them coastal and shellfish, and there were some freshwater lochs with red and brown trout and a few salmon in some of the rivers. There were also numerous birds, including various varieties of geese and pigeons. So birds on the shore and in the hills, and there were also deer. Dr. Johnson, when he visited Skye earlier in the 1700s, commented on the geese there being served roast goose, which tasted like fish. So I wonder whether he was served roast solan goose, which was actually a gannet, which would definitely taste like fish, or the Scottish goose, but it was a seabird in that situation. So again, would have been a fish-eating bird, probably fish flavoured. So lots of birds still, and lots of fish. The herrings, he says, that could produce income were reducing in quantity and few were exported. So herring fishing was a possibility, but wasn't, not many were exported. But certainly they could gather. You can hear, here's a view out, sound of Scalpe, probably from the mouth of the Obi. Easy access to the shore. It's not obvious whether that was free to everybody who could get there or not, but if you were permitted, then there's a way to get it on a calm day like this. Easy fishing from a boat, easy gathering of shellfish and other local shore things that, you know, whatever grows on the shore.
Not much talk about like fishing as a commercial operation. No, is there, like earning income from fish? Or
no, it's more feeding themselves, I think.
Yeah. Farming itself was because of these sort of flat valleys and not such hilly country, and perhaps not even as rocky as some of the parts we looked at previously. They used horse ploughs. They had 15 small horse-drawn ploughs that were used in the parish for the 25 farms that they had, so that, you know, presumably that means they could plough their fields mainly with horses. And they had the unusual thing of saddling them up, if that's the word, 4 abreast. So this is a sort of configuration here with these smaller horses yoked together with 4 in a row, and they would pull them through. But look at these, and sometimes they used a crooked spade, of course, the Scottish traditional spade for rocky ground. But look at this number of black cattle. This is where they make, this is where the money is in these black cattle, because they're very valuable. This is what they look like, of course, we know. And they have a big number of them here. Is it right to think they sell about 1/3 of them each year?
Well, that's what I worked out. I don't know how I worked it out.
And a lot
to meet the parish rent, I worked out they'd have to sell about 1/3 of them each year. Yes. Yeah,
that's right. And look at this number of horses. You know, remember when we did Locks Parish, which is not that different really, on Harris. Locks. The locals were telling us they couldn't possibly have had 300 or whatever it was horses. Look, this parish has, for 1,500 people only, it has 500 horses. Wow. Isn't that amazing? That's, you know, like a lot per family. And some number of sheep, although it's not talked about anything like sheep farming or, you know, the sort of sheep, the sort that we have learned to love or not. This is just, I think, more like domestic sheep, small holdings. And then he talks about well above 180 goats in the parish. So you can see the big thing here is the black cattle and a bit of agriculture with the 4-horse team. So they get the sort of money they get from the black cattle is that's £3 8 shillings, not 3.8 pounds. So it's a bit less really, and the 10 shillings to the is only 0.5, so it's under £3.5 pounds. So two to £3.5 roughly they get per head. So that's quite a decent income when compared to the sort of salaries that people earn and so on, just by having them wandering around eating. And markets are held May and July with the drovers coming, I guess. They call them trysts there. Quite an interesting term, isn't it? Trysts, used for that purpose. Sheep, they only get 6 shillings a head for. It's not so good. And there's a bit of talk about there being a market in butter and cheese. And he talks about it by the stone. Now, you might know what a stone is, but I don't know what a stone is anymore. It's something like 6.5 kilos.
It's for 14 pounds.
Yes.
14 pounds, right.
Yeah.
And so that's the sort of money they're getting for that. I don't know how much work there would be in making cheese and butter, but I imagine quite a bit. And there's not really a market for like fowls, you might call it, ducks and geese and hens, or their eggs. So, you know, it's a pretty, not a very commercial sort of place, I think you'd say. They need a bit of money to pay for to buy the meal each year that they need to live with. And they need a bit of money to pay their rents, of course, for using their land. But apart from that, I don't think they would carry a credit card with them when they went out every day.
And I think of the animals that they were grazing as sort of stratified. You've got the cattle on the decent flattish area, the sheep as we start to get up into the hills, and then the goats crawling around the bits of the rock that they can still get to, and then bare rock above that. And I suppose the ducks and hens cluttering around the household here. So, yeah, sort of layers.
Stratified.
Yeah.
And here's a picture of looking towards the eastward direction. And this is called a tatty bogle, this sort of scarecrow. We learnt yesterday it's a term from Aberdeen. So it seems to be a Scotland-wide thing, tatty bogle. Agricultural improvements.
So could Mr. Fraser suggested that improvements could happen in the agriculture. Of course, that's what the Oz Statistical Account was asking them to do, was look for ways life could be improved. The inhabitants, he said, needed longer leases, implying that would give them the chance to spend more time developing things. But of course, they'd also need sufficient capital to actually do something. Buy manure or whatever. He doesn't suggest what they should do, but they needed sufficient capital. And for this, he suggests that the proprietors take the fish and the black cattle, so fish there are suggested as a cash crop, in exchange for the rent, or help them get better markets for these so that they could then have income to use to improve the country. He's concerned that peat is the only fuel and that a great part of the summer is wasted in digging it and leading it home, as he says. He doesn't suggest what the alternative would be. There are no trees really on Skye to chop down for firewood, although today there's forestry planting, but not then. He did come from Inverness, where he would have been able to have ready access to coal. But if you think about how goods would have got in and out of Strath across on the ferry, we don't think that getting coal there was the answer. So I think peat remained their fuel, but he saw it as a waste of time. Salt was often scarce and sometimes there was none. He mentions that on an occasion when the greatest shoal of herrings entered the loch, a barrel sold for 2 shillings fresh, when if they had salted it, it would have sold for 12. So there's a loss of potential sales there for the lack of salt. There was one of the presumably gentleman farmers, McDonald of Skye, the largest of the 3 islands, who encouraged the people who came as his tenants, sort of subtenants, I suppose, to improve their land. And he says it was former wasteland became thriving farmland. So it was possible, but clearly longer leases, sufficient capital, and someone who cared to help the people who were working the land to see a way forward for improvements. Is what the picture is. There we are with a light dusting of snow in the winter.
And look at this mountain here in the distance, isn't it? Fantastic.
That's this is the Obby, which is a stream through Lower Breakish, and that's the other side of it. And then the sea is behind that, and that's an island. And I can't remember what it's called. It's one of the little ones. It's volcanic, you can tell from looking at it. Yes.
I'm trying to get it to go along.
It just wants us to look. But that's probably, sort of 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So how did they get around on Strath? Well, they walked mostly. The Fraser found the roads in the parish indifferent, and also copied that there was only one ferry in the southeast extremity. So even today, there are not that many roads in Strath, and only really one highway, and all the rest are one-way roads. If you haven't driven there and you're not used to driving on roads where you have oncoming traffic, you'll be very surprised. Some places you can't even see what's coming, but there are little passing bays that you sometimes have to back into. So roads then were almost non-existent. They followed the passes and valleys, and they also used horses for transport, particularly if they were going any distance. The 501 horses would have come in handy if they weren't already tied to the plough. Dr. Johnson on his journey observed that when riding a horse on Skye, sometimes the hill is too steep for the horseman to keep his seat, and sometimes the moss is too tremulous to bear the double weight of horse and man, especially Dr. Johnson, who wasn't small. The rider then dismounts and all shift as they can. So even horse riding wasn't without its challenges. No mention is made of boats as a mean of transport. Presumably to fish, they would have had boats to go out to get the fish out in the bays and locks. So presumably they could also use those to move around, but you certainly couldn't use a boat. There'd be no canoeing up this river. Rocks, a horse could pick its way, that's about it, yeah. So who were the proprietors? This had been MacLennan land, but they'd lost it because of their support for the Jacobites. So the proprietors at the time, Fraser says, the people much regret that their proprietors stay too short time among them to obtain a full and true account of the real state of the people. So they weren't there and they didn't know what was going on, is what he feels. This you can introduce to Lord MacDonald. He was born Sir Alexander MacDonald. He attended Eton College. He was in the Coldstream Guards. He was eventually created the first Baron MacDonald of Slate, and he's known as Lord MacDonald, and you'll see that name written in some of the immigration records. People they have to give their estate. It says Lord MacDonald, so either he or his descendants. So it's an uncommon title really for a Scottish title, but he's Lord MacDonald. He was a soldier. He raised the MacDonald Highlanders, but he spent most of his life serving king and country. The country being England. I think people felt he was more English than Scottish, and he basically wasn't there. He just was the owner. The second proprietor, as they were termed in this place, was Alexander McAllister, who bought the Strath estate, carved off from the MacDonald land, in 1786. It was 1,500 acres, and it's this peninsula known as the Algol Peninsula, and from Loch Parish at the top and down. So it's a separate estate. McAllister, not a lot of good farmland on it by the look. Lots of hills and a big mountain at the top. And McAllister built the stone house that you see here, and it's still there. Later in Georgian times, another McAllister, the original house was leaky, so he built the Georgian house next door rather than repairing the first one. They're known as the Cow and Calf. Today they've both been restored and have indoor plumbing and all modern things, so that it was owned from 1979 to 94 by Jethro Tull frontsman Ian Anderson. So with rock money, he paid to live there, and he also invested in local fisheries. And you can see with the two large sea locks on either side, it's a a good place for fisheries. But it shows again that to develop anything, you needed money in the 1790s and in the 1970s. I've also found an Australian McAllister who is laying claim to the title unsuccessfully and to the land. And I think he has been actually trespassed from it at times. So, but he's sure that he just is the correct descendant to have inherited it.
These maps that you can't, with the foot, you see the foot there, and it's got this blue trail going around. It's a walking track thing. It's called something like Walk Scotland or some title like that. And they're very handy for research sometimes, even though, well, you could go for a walk there, one of these walks. They're very interesting and well described, you know. Here you'll see this and here you'll see that, and now there's a steep part and now it's flat and so on. It's actually quite useful for getting the old perspective because it's telling you about the gradients and the, you know, things to see. And they often put in, you know, like antiquities that you can find on these maps that you wouldn't find on other just ordinary contemporary like driving maps designed for people driving cars. And so, well, yeah, they're quite useful.
You can see that the yellow and white is the road. So even today, that's the road. There's not a lot of road in Strath. But at the bottom in antiquities, we have Prince Charles Cave. So more about that later. But yes, very interesting.
Other things too, like this thing here and you know, this thing here. They're like,
yes, they're old things, and it comes with descriptions of those and how to get there, and what it's like to actually walk there.
So it's quite a handy thing if you're feeling like anywhere in the Highlands you want to look up a place, have a go at this and see if they've got walks there. You might be tempted to take the walk, but you also will get some little bit of detail, often about antiquities. That bit of a surprising source, really. Let's talk a little bit about the wages that people earn. So you remember how much they earned for just letting one black cattle head get about in their patch. That was about the same amount as this. So they could work themselves for a whole year, or they could just have one or two cattle and earn the same amount of money. So it makes the cattle look pretty attractive, doesn't it? These are like sort of feudal arrangements usually. This is like a manservant who would be, you know, in the relationship of like master and servant with the farm, the estates that were owned by, you know, more lofty folk. And they also got 3 pairs of shoes, probably this sort of shoes here that allowed the water to both get in and get out again. The important being, you know, with these laces like you see on brogues today. An overseer, or what, you know, might be called a grieve in Scotland, earns a bit more and gets some seed. I think the seed is designed perhaps for use on the fields that will be harvested rather than his personal seed for his own personal use. And because typically these grieves, they're more like a sort of senior servant than they are like a person working on their own account. Women servants get about 12 shillings, that's a bit over £0.5 to 20 shillings, that's £1 a year, and some shoes thrown in, not specified how many. Probably depends on how heavy the work is, eh? But the really interesting thing here is that the statistical account says there's not one person who describes himself solely as a tradesman of one sort or another. You know, one of these, like we've seen in other places, you have ploughman, blacksmith, what are some of the others, Kay?
Carpenter, tailor, weaver.
Carpenter, yeah, those weaver.
Even fishermen, he says it's not.
Yeah.
Not nobody's solely that. Yeah.
Not full time. And really, that's a very good indication for the whole of the country, really. And you see it in censuses throughout the Highlands that people one time will describe themselves as a, you know, occupation, like a weaver, say, and then another time as a, you know, farmer or a crofter or a fisherman, or, you know, they chop and change. So they're not really like totally focused on one occupation. Blacksmiths might be a little bit different because they probably need more kit to do what they do. And ploughmen, I think, typically would work using the plough owned by the estate rather than owned by themselves, although some of them did move about a bit. Mason is another example of that, isn't it? That sometimes people will be described as a mason, then other times not. Or maybe another time a dyker, that's another occupation. So this is the very traditional church. This site of the church in this parish goes back to the very early days of Christianity, 7th century. Serviced by Malriva, that's the original Christian monk that was based in Applecross. Not this building, of course, but this building too goes back a really long way the one they're actually using at the time of the statistical account is this building. And
16th century, it says.
Was built in the 16th century and still in use not only in 1790s, but right through till the 1840s. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? This really old building. Presumably it had a thatched roof, not a slate roof, because slate was not readily available at this time. In the churchyard, or kirkyard as you might call it, around the church there are many old graves and many McLennans buried there. Of course, this is a big parish for McLennans, and you see a lot of people, our people, marrying McLennans. So if you see a McLennan marrying a McLennan, that's what you'd expect to see here. This church is located, if you're coming across the Skye Bridge and then driving towards Broadford, it's probably roughly 2/3 of the way along that road, but it's between the road more or less follows the coast of the sea. And this is between the road and the sea. So the narrow band between the road and the sea. So typically these churches were close to the sea. The name of it in the more traditional name is Kil Christode or whatever, but it means Christ Church or Kill Christ, sometimes spelt with a K, and that's a sort of church. The kill word is a word you see a lot, meaning a religious place, like a monastery or a cell. A Christian cell would be like a name. Then this is the same word as cell. Other chapels and religious spots are around about, and some of them are on the islands as well. You have these sort of very spectacular places looking out over the sea, and former papish churches or places where preaching would take place, and these old wells here. So some of them don't have any church building, or certainly don't anymore, but were places where preaching took place commonly. Anything else there, Kay?
I think just that there was only the one church, and all of these were outdoor places where they preached. And if it was too wet, then he went into one of the people's huts, it's described, and as many as could fit in followed, and that was that. So not well served for churches in the parish. So who preached there? At the time of the writing, the statute tells us it was the Reverend Donald McKinnon, that good Strath name. He was preceded by Donald Nicholson, who had been a tacksman and a sportsman, and then called to the ministry, and he was described as a man of uncommon probity and goodness. So Donald Nicholson was a hard act to follow, but along came Donald McKinnon. He'd been born in Strath, educated in Aberdeen, been a missionary in Benbecula, and in 1779 came to Strath. He was followed by generations of ministers. His son John also served in Strath, went on to serve in various places around the world, including being in New Zealand during the Maori Wars. He was described as the best example of a Scottish clergyman I ever knew. Praise, probably. And John had a son, unsurprisingly, he named Donald, who also served as minister in Strath, and then he moved to Melbourne, Australia. There were other sons of John who also moved to Melbourne, Australia. One was a founding proprietor of a major newspaper, the Melbourne Argus, and then a grandson established the horse racing, famous race, the McLennan Stakes. So the McLennans left their marks in Australia, but Donald McLennan was the minister in Strath. What he didn't do was write the old statistical account. So ever since I saw the name on the top didn't match the minister, I've been puzzled as to why. But I think in this letter that I found in the, which is held in the Highland, what's it called? The Clandonald Library and Museum of the Isles. It's a letter in 1804, so a few years later, but he is saying his stipend, according to the statistical account, was about £80. It included a glebe and a small communion allowance. Well, in 1804, he is writing to say that he hasn't received the stipend. He hasn't received any meal, any allowance for communion elements, and you never get bread and wine for nothing. He has no manse. There's no money for a manse. The heritors have been asked to build a manse and nothing's happened. The church is in a ruinous state with broken windows and it's too small for the congregation. The factor says he can't give him any meal or any allowance for the communion elements. And because of this, his cattle stock have reduced and he has large bills he can't afford to pay. So he feels that his case should be listened to in the Court of Sessions, but in the meantime, he will shelter himself in the common asylum of insolvent debtors. So he's not a happy chap. And I think when he was asked to write the statistical account a few years earlier, that he chose not to, rather forcefully, I suspect, because he wasn't getting paid. So instead, the account was written by Thomas Fraser of the Inverness Academy. Now, there was a Royal Inverness Academy established in 1792 for the liberal education of boys of the upper classes throughout the Northern Highlands. Probably know McLennans. It was based on the original grammar school in this building, and then more buildings were built later. Thomas Fraser taught the Gaelic class, which did not always have pupils year to year. So whether they didn't need to learn it or didn't want to isn't clear. He also helped in reading, writing, arithmetic, and bookkeeping. And then in 1795, he left to pursue a better teaching offer, or perhaps to write the Strath statistical account. He's one of 12 people employed by Sinclair to write accounts in parishes where the minister either couldn't or wouldn't. So he's Thomas Fraser of Inverness. Now, my concern about him writing it is that unlike Donald McLennan, he didn't live there, wasn't born there, didn't really know the people probably. And a lot of his comments are quite negative. He says there's no decent roads, no other grain than oats, no use for the marble. Remember that Sinclair had sent out a questionnaire with 160 questions, basically, and then added a few more about schooling. And the responses in this one, to me, are almost like ticking the box. He does check with McLennan about the population figures because there's a little asterisk comment that the incumbent says that these figures are about right. But in other cases, I do wonder whether he talked to the right people or whether he asked the right questions or whether he just gave an incomers, as Skye people tend to call us visitors, an incomers view of how things were. I mean, I think his comments on Pete are quite illustrative of that. But that's just, perhaps I'm reading too much into the fact that somebody else wrote the account.
With that in mind, he talks about the character of the people. He starts off by saying something that you could take either way and is obviously not going to offend anybody. He says that in general, they could be tall or could be short, but they're a middling size. Well, of course, that's almost tautology, isn't it? That in general, they're middle. You know, what is middle? It's general, you know. Anyway, so now you know Kay's take on it. I think there's might be something in this. And then he says, to a tolerable degree, they enjoy the comforts of life. Well, that too is a bit sort of wishy-washy, isn't it? Not sticking his neck out there or putting his head above the parapet. However, he does say that dress, diet and lodging are in need of amendment, or perhaps you could say improvement, that dress, diet and lodging. That's, you know, I guess fairly obvious, really, that from what we know, where they lived and so on was could be greatly improved. And he suggests a lot, the sort of obvious things really, suggests that longer leases and encouragement to improve. So that's no biggie either, really. He suggests that the proprietors might take fish and black cattle in lieu of rent, or that they might set up markets to try and get some more money into the hands of the local people. And that's probably also a bit self-evident, I would have thought. I don't think he's really excelling himself with any radical proposals here. Now, the devil, let's talk about the devil, whiskey. And this is not a photo from the 1790s of the Cale Aiken Inn. It's actually, but it was there, this hotel in the 1790s. How many ensuite bedroom rooms are there now?
It has 81 ensuite bedrooms. Yes.
Well, we don't think the ensuites were there in the 1790s. Quite unlikely, really. But it's this hotel. Do you remember where this place is, Kyle? And it's it's just on the arrival point from the crossing from Glenelg. And so this is a important spot for an inn while you wait for your ferry, isn't it? Or wait to swim your cattle across or whatever. I don't know how quite they would have, or take your horse maybe. Anyway, this is the hotel that's there. And he talks about the whiskey that they consume in great quantities here in this parish, that it doesn't grow here, of course. They don't grow barley here, so they can't make their own whiskey. And so the whiskey is imported typically from Ferntosh. That means that's that part of, you remember, Urquhart and Logie Wester Parish that has a license to produce whiskey without excise. So it's a pretty big deal. And it's brought in bottles, sold in bottles, in many places throughout the parish. And of course, he wouldn't be doing his job if he didn't warn against the moral hazards of drinking whiskey. And he says that the consequences might be poverty, quarrelling, and immorality. All these things are possible. As for schooling in the parish, there's just one parochial school to cover this fairly extensive parish, but that's not unusual. The salary of the schoolmaster is a pitiful £22 a year, including the scholars' fees that they get charged for doing certain courses. So it's a terrible thing. And you think the minister's pay is £80 a year, or should be. They didn't get it, but should be. The schoolmaster's pay is woefully low. 60 odd scholars attend the school during the winter. You remember, this is going to be a pretty short day's schooling because of the hours of sunlight, and the electric lights didn't work very well in those days. And that, but by the summer, when there is light and so on, scarcely half of that number attend the school. Some of them, I guess, might be off with their mothers and their siblings in the hills, in shieldings, summer grazing for cattle, stop them chunking around on the grass to allow it to grow for winter. But some also might be required on their local home activities, doing things with the crops and the animals that they might have. So yes, fewer people turn up to school in the summer, only 30 odd. And the writer suggests that an extra school might be needed. Perhaps it's in the Strath, he doesn't say, but in Strath Aird, That's a long way to walk to school every day. Poor, is this you? Yes.
This is me, yeah. There were 15 poor recorded in the parish at this time, and there was no fund for them except what came from weekly collections and the fines of delinquents. And it generally amounted to £4 to £5 a year. Now, unfortunately, we have no Skye Kirk session reports to know what crimes the delinquents were fined for. But from the Perth Kirk records, the amount of a fine varied according to the seriousness of the offence and whether recidivism had occurred. For instance, anti-nuptial fornication had a standard penalty of 40 shillings for the first time, and that was from 1577, and it doubled each time the offence was repeated. So clearly it wasn't too much of a disincentive. In very rare cases, you could stop having to be publicly humiliated to just pay a fine. Quarrelling could be, you could be fined for quarrelling, especially if it had been in public. Here we have an illustration from probably a city church, I'd imagine, from the size of it. Young man in the dock situation, accused of fornication. The girl that he has, who is suffering, weeping with her mother. His parents looking equally ashamed beneath him. The minister haranguing him from I suppose it's the pulpit. And then sitting around, I'm not sure if those are the clerks of the session or if they're just people who paid for a good seat, I don't know. But this public way of dealing with it, so it's not just being fined, but it's being publicly shamed, was how matters of immorality were dealt with. Probably drunkenness could end you up there too. Lot of babies born out of wedlock, all sorts of crimes, but it went towards paying for the poor. We do wonder if the poor acted immorally, how they paid for their fines, but that's not recorded. Anyway, there are only 15 poor at the time.
And the dogs, we don't know.
We don't know what they're driving the dogs out the door, I think.
What the point of that is.
Yes, and I'm not sure, I should really have noted who the artist was. It's probably someone famous, yeah. Health, housing and diet. The account doesn't really address the diet, but clearly they lived on some oats, a lot of potatoes, fish, any wildlife they could catch, any dairy produce that they made that they didn't have a market for, and perhaps some meat, although the meat was generally probably kept, probably more of the sheep meat than the cattle. One of the other things I was just thinking about living on oats that's occurred to me, in none of the parishes yet have we mentioned any form of sweetener. There is a native Scottish bee I read, but I don't know whether it liked the moist island climate and whether the hives there were exploited or not. And no parish yet has mentioned, as far as I know, anything to do with any sweetener. We do know that the West Indies by then had sugar plantations, and there were some links from those to some of the parishes we've seen before, but we imagine that the sugar only got to the gentry and not to the ordinary folk. But it's an interesting thought. Did they live without sweetening? The varied diet and the absence of smallpox seems to have sustained the population so that some live to 80 or 90 years old. And the writer notes that the most frequent distempers are rheumatism, colds, and nervous fevers, which he attributes to the moist and foggy and air and frequent rain. So yeah, that's Scotland. Skye is known as the Misty Isle. So here is beautiful, clear sky, but that's only for photographs.
Probably photoshopped.
Yes. So I think that's the island. Now here is, they had a special way of dressing the corn, the cereal grain that they were getting from the oats. There were no mills, so instead of having to prepare things for milling, they burnt straw to a flame and then heated the grain, and that turned it black. And then they ground that into meal on the quern. So you can see the young woman here in this posed photograph is picking up the grain out of the bucket on her left and dribbling it into the hole in the middle of the two grinding stones and turning the top stone against the bottom stone. And I presume the stuff falls out the bottom.
You all know these stones. Have you seen them in museums and things? Anybody want to ask about them? Susan, do you know them? Don't know them, can't. You'll see them in a lot of the museums in Scotland. They make the stones up so that there's a space between the two stones, and then there's this hole in the top here of the top one and a handle on here. And then she's picked the grain out of this little bucket here, and she's got it in her hand, and she's just letting it dribble out through the bottom of her hand and turning this wheel around to grind up the oats and make a meal out of it, make meal. You know,
Bruce, one of my ancestors brought a quern to Glengarry as part of her dowry, and it now is part of the collection in the Glengarry Pioneer Museum in Dunvegan.
Wow.
Wow.
That's good, isn't it?
Yeah, it's wonderful. We have a wonderful photograph of it.
So this was a very normal thing for people to do, especially here where there was no town mill, no mill owned by the laird. You get the idea now? Anybody want to ask any more about these things? Querns.
It was regarded as women's work, and the fact that it was part of her dowry makes that very clear, doesn't it? That she came equipped with the way of producing the meal. Yeah. So the Skye black oatmeal was black but tasty and very wholesome, and even Dr. Johnson commented on it that it was black but it was tasty. So certainly something that happened there. The Fraser's concerned that people might think burning the straw was a waste of straw, but he explains that the cattle are out in the pasture all winter as the snow does not lie deep or long, so the straw wasn't needed. Now, again, this is one of those things that made me wonder about them, because it does, we saw that other photo of the snow by the coast, and of course with the coastal influence, you don't get a lot of deep snow lying around. But there are other stories of houses shared with the cattle inside, in the black houses, probably for warmth on both for the people as well. So we wonder who's right. Were they out all the time, or were they in some of the time? But certainly they still had straw to burn, to flame and heat the grain.
Yeah, there's no talk about bleeding. You know, that was a thing in other parts, that they bleed from the necks, the cattle, and put that into the meal, the oats. Maybe in a sausage, maybe not.
Yes, their black pudding would be very black, wouldn't it, if they're using
yummy.
Black oats? Yes.
Especially yummy.
Yes. Yes,
it could be. I was looking at this thing here and wondering what that was all about, this big basket. It could be that basket, I'm just speculating here, is a way of removing any chaff and stuff.
Yeah.
From the grain. You toss it up and
down, yeah.
The wind blows away the light things, and the harder, heavier ones come down back into the basket.
There's a sack there. I was going to say a sugar bag, but clearly it's not. There's a sack, and it looks like a broom almost. So yes, I'm
not sure it's not a sort of mallet thing. This, you know, they
might be.
pack things with and make a sort of pre-grinding.
Yeah,
but I don't know about that.
No, we'll have to go and practice. I'm sure there's a working museum somewhere you can go and turn the quern. Yes, but
so that's good.
Language. Skye is the heart of the Gaelic revival, and it was the language spoken there then, and still now. It's interesting though that very few of the place names, and most of them have come from the Norse or Danish or Viking influence. So it's interesting that, but now today they tend to also have a Gaelic name. So the name for Broadfoot, which you'd think was English, but I think does come from the Norse tradition, also has a Gaelic name, which I shan't try and pronounce. The school, though, the children, we don't know. Probably they were taught in English, because most of the written materials would be in English, and we wonder whose children attended. With the 60 children out of 1,500 in the parishes, is not everybody, quite a few. but it's quite likely that certainly those who did go to school had some English instruction. Yeah.
Learned some English, yeah.
Learned some English, yeah.
Let's look at the McLennans now in this parish. Here we've got some famous McLennans, but just hold on there a minute and I'll tell you about those. This is not a big, as it appears in the list, it's not one of the big ones over here. This is way around on the circle here. And there's just 1% of the births recorded, but we know this is a pretty rough and ready way of working out how many McLennans live in the parish, because one, there had to be a record of them being baptised, and maybe they weren't. And two, they had to live the other way. They got to be classified as from this parish in our records, is that they had to live from the time we're talking about till the 1851 census, and then they tell us the parish they're from. So, this is a bit dodgy. That's what it is. And
like Mr. Fraser, yes.
And but we do know that there are a number of significant McLennans came from here, and that's why we've included it in our list of parishes to do. By the way, I do have a plan to do Glenelg, if anybody wants to put their hand up, Donald, don't I? It would be quite good to do that as an additional parish, if anybody wants to put their hand up to research another one.
A long-term plan, Bruce.
Yeah. But somebody might volunteer, Donald, jump the queue.
Well, we have several who are keen when the time comes.
You could collaborate. But there were 20 marriages in this parish that involved a McLennan bride or a McLennan groom up to 1885. So, we got a number from here. Here's an example of one of them from our clan records. This is a page for those of you that don't know our clan records. This is the sort of thing that you see, the person's name, the parish where they were born is listed there. And this is the date they were born, and then the date they died. Now, this person did the right thing by us, researchers, and died in 1855. Can anybody tell me why I say he did the right thing by us in choosing to die in 1855? Donna knows. Come on, Donna, you can do it. Oh, no.
It would have been after the 1851 census, right?
Oh, yeah, but there's a better reason than that. That's why he chose to die on this year. Donna knows. Do you know, Donna? Come on, it's important to know this. Really important if you're going to do any research in Scotland. In 1855, statutory registration came in. That's a really big thing in its own right. But the big deal is that the first form they used for death registrations particularly, and remember that there were virtually no death records in Scotland up to 1855, especially in the Highlands. There might have been in Edinburgh and places like that, but in the Highlands there was no record of deaths, just nothing. And so 1855 is a big year to get a lot more information. But what you got in the 1855 form to be filled in for a death was much, much more useful than the ones that were used in 1856, the form. In 1855, not only did they say the name of the person and the place they died and the parents of the person, but they also included the place where they were born. That's why we know this guy was born there. That's the only reason, really. We know he was born there. Maybe. No, we know also from his 1851 census, of course. And also you get the place where they're buried, which is why we know that he was buried in that churchyard that we saw earlier. Yeah. So if you find an 1855 death, in your family, celebrate. Go and have a bottle of champagne. That'll be the best thing to do. And then go back and read it the next day, probably. So you can see here that he's born. He says he's born in Strath in the 1851 census, and this is the 1841 census where they didn't collect the place of birth, apart from saying that they were born in the county where they were currently living or not. So you're either from Inverness-shire, for example, this parish is in Inverness-shire, don't forget, or you're from Ross and Cromarty, that's all. If they say no to that question, not born in the current parish where you're living, then it could be from anywhere else in the whole of Scotland. Or even could be outside Scotland, unlikely, but it could be outside. So you can see then that the 1851 census, very valuable thing, but in particular the 1855 deaths, fantastic. This fellow,
in the clan tree, Bruce, I mean, is the largest percentage by far individuals who lived their entire life in Scotland, and how would it break out, just even very roughly, people in the tree that emigrated to Australia, New Zealand, United States, Canada?
Yeah, well, we have got that in the stats where they went to. I don't know quite it answers your question exactly, but we talk about the numbers who migrated from Scotland to different countries. You can go and get the stats to tell you that number. I don't know off the top of my head, Donald, but it's probably quite a lot. I don't know. I'd be guessing.
But the bulk of the records are those that spent their life in Scotland.
No. So we certainly try to look for it's a worldwide database, and we try to look for them in other parts. Sometimes, as you know, Donald, well, if they are living in, say, Ontario, would be the most likely place, or could be in Quebec, they might just say they were born in Scotland, and they won't tell us where in Scotland they were born in their later records, either the death record or the censuses. They just say Scotland. Occasionally they'll say a place, and as we saw, Donald, in one of them, it had Glenelg. How good was that? But it's rare for them to say in the censuses overseas the part of Scotland they came from. Sometimes you see it on the headstones in the foreign country, like in Ontario or in other parts. They'll say a native of Glenelg, Scotland. Glenelg's or Inverness-shire even. Or Inverness. And it could mean Inverness might not mean the county, which this is in Inverness, right? Inverness County. So if they say on the headstone a native of Inverness, it could mean Inverness-shire, because they typically won't put that, as you see here in this example. Inverness just put like that, where they're born. But you've got to remember, this doesn't mean Inverness place. You could be tricked, couldn't you, thinking, you see I've added in there the square bracket, as you call brackets, to show that it's the county of Inverness, not the town, because you could think, if you didn't know, that would mean Inverness town. So it's the county. So that in this census, the 1841 census, they tell you that if they're born in the county where they're currently living, yes, it's just a yes/no question. It doesn't actually say Inverness in the document. Okay. Now, as you might expect from our earlier discussions, of course, this McLennan person married a McKinnon when they lived in Strath, didn't they? I mean, what other choice did you have, really? Most of the people were McKinnons, as far as we can tell. And Marion McKinnon was his wife. She also was from this part of the world. I can't see whether she's actually from Strath, but there's a good chance, isn't there? Because it's a ugly word to have to research, being born in Strath. I mean, there's so many lovely, unique words in Scotland, even words like Kintail and Lockout, even Lochalsh are easy to research. But when you put the word Strath in as a place to see if someone was born or died or whatever, you get all these other things with Strath in them. There are many other counties, parishes that have the word Strath in them. And so you get a lot of results back. It's quite hard to research this particular parish with that in mind. It's a pity they didn't keep the Swartle part of it. Would have made it a lot easier to find people. So this is a person who lived their whole life in Strath. They're born in Strath, they died in Strath, they married in Strath, they were buried in Strath, right? This Donald. So, he's a very good case. Now let's look at another one where the people who were born in Strath migrated, in this case, to New South Wales. And a bit of a limitation for people who lived there, you remember, was that they were Gaelic speakers, and that was all they knew. So this John here went to New South Wales, and when he arrived, he said that his uncle was already living in the colony, and that other family members from Strath were living there. And he went to live in a Gaelic-speaking enclave in this place north of Sydney. You see here, there was a Gaelic-speaking enclave there, and he went there to be amongst his kinfolk and be able to communicate with them. Like someone got £30 for bringing this person into the country. Someone died, one of their kids died on the sea voyage, and went on to, have descendants all over the place. So that's an example of a migration story. And here's another one. This is what you've been waiting for. I know I haven't been holding out on you, honest. But this family that went to Texas gave their name to the county which has as its state seat the town of Waco. You probably know Waco gets mentioned often in the context of the Bush family. The presidents have presence there in McLennan County, Texas, TX. The sort of hero of it was Neil, often called Neil Love McLennan. These are all the children of John and Catherine. Neil, John, Lachlan, Flora and Abigail are the children who went from Strath to, first of all, North Carolina, and lived there for a while. Many did, like they went there in the 1780s, I think, or thereabouts. In 1801 they went there. But people like Flora MacDonald, who helped Prince Charles Edward to escape from Scotland, she went with her MacDonald husband, where she was both MacDonald by maiden name and also married name, went to live in the Carolinas, and they were involved in defending the king and country in the Revolutionary War, or the Rebel War, and then they came back to Skye and died there. But they had gone there after Culloden because of her involvement. Yeah? So that was a sort of escape route in those earlier times for people who'd supported the Jacobites in the various Jacobite risings. And these people did much the same, went there to be amongst their countrymen. You remember when we talked about migration in last year's meeting, that we talked about how the Cape Fear, and that doesn't mean the Cape Fear, it means the Cape Fear Valley going back along the Cape Fear River, was a very much Gaelic-speaking enclave in the Carolinas. So, even their slaves spoke Gaelic. How about that in the Carolinas? But it's said in the history of these McLennans who went from Strath to the Carolinas that they were invited by an Indian chief in Florida to come and live there. I don't know, that might be a bit of a stretch of the story, right? But in the 1820s, they went to live in Florida for a while, and then 14 years later, they went around to Pensacola and then to the coast of Texas, and then inland in Texas to the Bosque River.
South Carolina's motto is "Do Sparrow, Sparrow."
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Who's saying that?
Rob.
Robert. Yeah, that's it. So they were settled. They were arriving in Texas. You remember Texas has had many statuses as an independent republic, as part of Mexico. During the Civil War, of course, they were separate from the 13 rebelling colonies, and so on. Lone Star State and so on. But they were there before, even before the Alamo. So they were, quite early. And of course, it was Mexican territory, although controlled by local Native Americans, or whatever we call them now, First Peoples, Indians. And this, in most of the accounts, they're referred to as Indians. And there's quite a lot of stories. If you go to our clan records, you can just look up McLennan County. You know that in the North American, mostly in North American places, those that have counties, we use the word county after the county name. So you might have Ontario County, Ontario, Canada. And so we put the county word in when something is a county. So you'll always have McLennan County to describe the county in our clan records. That makes it easier to look up places where you've got the same name for a county and a province in Canada or in the states in US. So the word, so if you look up McLennan County, you'll see all these people there already. That's as simple as it is. And you can go there and read about the stories of these people. It's quite well documented pictures. In 1834, this family was attacked by Indians, as they called at that time. And the mother, Catherine, and the son, John, were killed by the Indians. And the son, John, was taken into the Indian camp to grow up amongst the Indians. And he grew through all his, into adult life as an Indian, going out on hunting parties, scalping Europeans, all the good things that Indians know how to do well. And then when he was of a reasonable age, he came back to live. After 12 years, he came back to live with the Europeans and found that a bit hard to resettle. He couldn't go scalping anymore and so on. So that's quite a story, the McLennans of McLennan County, TX. Some of you know that story already? Never heard of it? Quite an interesting story. So just go and look up McLennan County in the death place and you'll get all the story about these. He's often called Neil Love McLennan. Love was one of the names of one of his aunts' maiden name. Antiquities, is this you, Kate?
This is me. Right, so in the account, Fraser noted that at the time there were some ruins, there were some remains of what he describes as Popish chapels, the green dots, one on Parve. Notice how they're all close to the coast because the missionaries, the top northern one on the coast is where St. Malruba allegedly came across from Applecross floating on a stone. So either it was pumice or it was a miracle. But so there were chapel ruins in those places, and there were also ruins of 7 towers. The red dots, this is a modern map of tower ruins now. There are no longer 7 in Strath. Whether they were quite like this photo, I don't know. But notice each tower was within sight of its neighbour or of another one. And even the ones on the south coast were opposite one on the mainland. So they were presumably signal towers of some sort, watchtowers. Fraser doesn't say what he thinks they were, and even this modern map didn't say what they were, but you can see that they're positioned so that they could communicate with one another. So those were the rocks that had been buildings, chapels and towers. There are also other interesting rocks. Next one, which is fossils. There are petrified rocks on Scalpa with petrified moss and shells. Parve has rocks and stones with petrified fish. You can see the bones. You can see that in that one. You can see eel. There's an eel up to 1/2 metre long. He said 20 inches in those days. And the top photo is mine of bird footprints. I think you can see them in the rock. So today you can certainly still wander along the beaches in Strath and find fossils. So it's an interesting place geologically. Limestone, you're always going to get caves because water and limestone create caves. This is the cave where supposedly Charles Stewart, the Pretender, as Fraser calls him, spent his last nights on Skye. So it's not where he arrived with Flora MacDonald, which was further up the coast, but where he sheltered before finally departing. It's only accessible at low tide, but it's still there. And you can see where the sea's been.
And the ensuite is still there, isn't it?
It is indeed, yes. Yes.
Restroom.
Yeah. So comfortable place. There'd be water dripping. There always is in limestone caves. So yeah, wouldn't want to spend too long there. But lots of fossils, lots of caves.
So the route that he came to get to here, where did he come from to here?
Well, he arrived further up the coast, was taken to Kingsborough House, which is again outside of Strath, and then across to Rasay, which is the bigger island north of Parish, stayed there for a while. And then when they'd obviously found a way to get him to France, came back and came down. So would have come across and down the Algol Peninsula, come across the sort of spine of Strath, I guess, perhaps on one of the horses on that tremulous moss, and to this cave and away. But
so he took the ship from here actually to leave, didn't he?
I imagine because because it was outside our period, I didn't look too hard at it. But yes, well, if he stayed here for the last night, he must have. And they were definitely the navigable locks. A ship of any burden could be there, so they'd row him out to it once it arrived, I guess.
So so that you leave with a earworm from today's meeting, we're going to give you a bit of entertainment now. Just relax and sit back, and if you like to sing along, feel free.
Sweet bonny board like a bird on the wing, onward the sailors cry. Carry the lad that's born to be king, over the sea to Skye. Low the wind howls, low the waves roar, thunder clatter in the air. Baffled of foes stand on the shore, for they will not dare. Sweet bonny board like a bird on the wing, onward the sailors cry. Carry the lad that's born to be king, over the sea to Skye. Many is the lad fought on that day, well the claymore did wield. When the night came, silently lay, dead on Culloden field. Sweet bonny board like a bird on the wing, onward the sailors cry. Carry the lad that's born to be king, over the sea to Skye. Though the waves sleep, soft will he sleep, ocean's a royal bed. Rocked in the deep, Flora will keep watch by her weary head. Sweet bonny board like a bird on the wing, onward the sailors cry. Carry the lad that's born to be king, over the sea to Skye.
Well, there you go. That's something to take away from today's meeting. You'll have that humming in your mind all day, we hope, or all night. Wake up in the morning. Okay.
Right. Something else that Fraser observed were a number of tumuli, or the Viking burial mound that you can see here in the east of Strath. There are none left today, probably because he says already some were dug up to reveal urns full of ashes. So presumably the ones that were on Strath have been dug up. This one is just slightly north in another parish, but just a lump in the hills really, that people would dig in and find urns of ashes. But also another way of marking a place where ashes were left were cairns, and this cairn is on the top of Ben Naculloch, that beautiful snow-topped mountain behind Broadford that we saw, and it's reputedly marks a site where Saucy Mary, a Norwegian princess, was buried, facing the land of her birth forever. So it's placed facing north up the Sound out to the open sea. It's a beautiful location on a beautiful day. So Saucy Mary was a Norwegian princess. And in the next slide, we see Castel Mole, which was a McLennan fortress. This is a ruin today, and it was a ruin, not quite such a ruin in 1790, but it still was a ruin. This is medieval, but it was built on the site of a former construction that Saucy Mary, who was a Norse princess, married to Findanus, the fourth McLennan chief, around the year 900. And they set up a establishment here that they then ran a heavy chain across the Sound, because that's the mainland just across there, and they levied a toll for all the shipping vessels that it was the only way through, so they levied a toll. But the location of their castle was here, also looking up the Sound towards her home, just as then her burial cairn was. So Saucy Mary was clearly a strong woman, an important person, and that Norse connection that takes us to Strathswardle, back to the combination of the Gaelic and the Norse influence that we have in this area. So thank you.
So you can unmute yourselves now and just talk about give us some thoughts about your perspective now on the advantages and disadvantages of living in this particular parish. Would you like to start with an advantage or a disadvantage? Who'd like to say, turn your mics on and chip in, say what you like, what you take away from today's meeting.
Seems like it might be challenging if you had a sweet tooth.
No ice cream.
Bruce, I actually have a question. I was curious why there was no market apparently for chicken and eggs and ducks and geese. I mean, was there a surplus? Did everybody have easy access to them, or why would they not have been there not have been a market for food?
Kay might have some other thoughts, but I think what we're seeing here is that this is a period when people were generally self-sufficient, that they grew their own produce, they grew their own small animals to eat. They had very little need of money because they didn't have opportunities for earning external income, and so they were really obligated to grow their own and therefore the other people didn't want to buy them because that was the norm, to just look after yourself. And you had your black cattle bringing in the principal income that allowed them to buy some meal. That answer you? What do you think, Kay? Is that?
I think so. I think that basically people would have, chooks around the house eating the grain that happened to fall, and
Chickens.
Just very domestic. And if you had eggs, and if you had an excess and your neighbour's hens had gone off the lay, you might barter those for some butter they'd made from their cow, but you wouldn't. No, I don't think money exchanged hands. I think each household basically probably fed itself with what it could gather from the, kill in the wildlife and fish and grow in the spuds. Yeah, I think.
It's very hard to put ourselves in that position,
Yeah,
isn't it?
yeah.
As describing, where you didn't have commercial markets for almost anything. Amazing to think of that these people, that's where they lived. And really for us, Donald, that's the sort of people that went on these migration journeys to, parts where they presumably were a bit more monoculture, and they had to do some more financial dealings of because they grew bigger areas or worked only in lumber or whatever. So they needed to then start earning income to buy other things. But these people who started out this journey were self-sufficient, basically. I think that's the answer.
Yeah.
And you also talked about the challenges related to transportation, I guess, getting things like chicken and eggs and ducks and geese to market. or
Yes.
whatnot.
Anymore, yeah.
I was going to say, Donald, that's a bit chicken and egg too. meaning, but like you don't have transport because you don't need it, or you don't transport things because there's no transport. Who knows which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Is that a good segue off your comment there, Donald?
Yeah.
Well, I was looking at a family, who were shepherd family in the back blocks, really back blocks of Kintail. So I'm talking real McLennan homeland here. And this family, they lived there really totally self-sufficiently. It was the best part of a day's walk to get out of this upland area where they were shepherds. Presumably it was good for shepherding because you knew all the sheep around, no fencing, of course, in those days. You knew all the sheep were your own. A bit of fox hunting required, but, they just were living there as a family. You married your neighbours. Amazing. That was really like a microcosm of what things were like in many other parts. Yeah, I think that's the story.
I'm getting the sense that this parish was more impoverished than some of the others we've seen because of a few things. Transportation, clearly, but there's no mention of boats coming in. Now, it could be that the guy that's writing this account really doesn't know the place as well as, say, the minister would have. But the fact that the minister wasn't paid, the fact that the schools weren't improved, the church building was not improved, and we're only talking one school and one building, either means that the heritors were completely negligent in their stimulating the local economy and caring for the people, or there was not much money to be made and they themselves were strapped. It just feels poor and disadvantaged.
I'd agree with that.
Perhaps overpopulated too. That's the thing that we saw in the population figures, wasn't it? The numbers had grown dramatically.
Yeah. But the care isn't there. It doesn't sound like there's been any kind of effort at improving anything.
Mm-hmm.
So Bruce, was there a lot of migration?
Yeah. Skye generally is renowned for its impoverished state when they were in desperate poverty and needed to leave. And we're now exploring some of the sort of attributes of that poverty more generally throughout Skye. Poverty was rampant particularly once the potato famine and so on came.
And this is probably the most, we haven't looked at the other parishes, but yesterday we had a woman who had worked there, and she felt that this was the most arable area of Skye.
Yeah.
That's where you could do the most. So imagine the other parts were, it's beautiful, but you can't eat beauty. There's people lived, I think, a subsistence lifestyle, which is fine if all the babies die of smallpox, but if they're all alive, then you've got a larger family. So there's kind of, you haven't got enough, you perhaps can't catch enough, or you've not allowed enough time off from working for the master to do your own fishing and grow your own things. So yeah, I think there is a sense of poverty, even though the actual poor role is not many. And
the point you made was that perhaps this is one of the better parishes on Skye.
Yes, we think this
really
might be the case. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for that. That's great to have a discussion there. So just quickly,
Bruce, I just wonder, we have a couple of members that could trace their ancestor to Skye, but this ancestor went to the States. and then came back to Glengarry as a UEL.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Might have been in the States in Carolina, in the Carolinas. The other source for United Empire Loyalists was in the Mohawk Valley, wasn't it, in New York? They're the typical two places, the Carolinas and Mohawk Valley. So yeah, could have known these people. Some of them we talked about in the Carolinas. Yeah, the McLennans who were there, for example. Interesting, isn't it, to think of? So thank you for that. I hope you've enjoyed today's session, and we've looked at the topography, the location, the extent of the size of it, the population, the sort of opportunities for earning income, something about the housing, the diet, the health, and a few of the McLennans who came from there, including the very important one, and the Heritors and the Minister, and something of the Curiosities, including leaving you with the Skyboat song to be in your heads for the next week. Thank you all for joining us today.